We added our first reducer, and thus far, NGRX is not doing anything for us. But we're getting there. The next step is that we also take care about the actions that we want to have, or about the one action which we support right now, adding an ingredient. We want to be able to dispatch this, and to dispatch this, and to there also reliably dispatch it in the same way by having the right identifier where we rule out typos, and by adding the right payload, ingredient that can be added here, we should also standardize this action creation process, or how such an action looks like. Because at the moment I'm just checking for this identifier here, but if I now would dispatch this action from anywhere in my code, I would have to make sure that I type this same identifier, and as you might imagine, if you're in a hurry, if your application is bigger, it's easy to forget a character, and then you have a bug that's super hard to spot, your app does not work correctly, and you waste hours looking for that stupid typo. To rule that out, NGRX also kind of at least pushes us into a direction where we have a clear pattern about creating and providing our actions as well. Now for that, I'll create a new file next to the shopping list reducer, and that is my shopping list.actions.ts file. Now, since the actions and the reducer kind of belong together and belong both to the NGRX setup, I'll add a new subfolder here in the shopping list folder, and I'll name it store because it's all related to the NGRX store. So let's move the reducer and the actions file into that store folder now. And now let's work on the shopping list actions file. Now in that file, I first of all want to export my identifiers, or my single identifier I have thus far, in a way that we can simply import it and we don't have to type it manually to rule out typos. So in the shopping list actions file, I'll therefore export a constant, which I also name add ingredient, though that name is totally up to you. And then I assign a value of add ingredient. Now this is a convention which I recommend following. You use a constant which's name is the same name as the one of your identifier, which in turn should be descriptive about what this action does. And you then simply store your string identifier in that constant. And by exporting it here in the actions file, we can import it into other files, like in our shopping list reducer file, where we need that action. And therefore, since we never have to type it again, and we just import it, and the IDE will yell at us if we mess up the import, it won't yell at us if we mess up a string. Therefore, for all these reasons, we now have a secure way where we rule out typos in the action identifiers. So now I will import add ingredient from the shopping list actions file here, and instead of using the string like this down there, I just use add ingredient like this, and this now refers to that string. Well, that's the first step, but of course this step doesn't ensure that we, for example, have the right payload. The next step therefore is that we export another thing that describes our action, and our action, if we go back to reducer, is of course not that string. Keep in mind the action is an object which needs to have a type property. So the action actually is an object, not a string. It is of type action, and action is imported from NGRX store. So it probably doesn't hurt if we grab that action import and we import it here in the shopping list actions TS file as well. And then what we export here should be our action, and that should be a class therefore, since the action is an object and objects can be created based on classes. That should have a descriptive name, and I'll name it add ingredient. Now, not all uppercase, because class names should be Pascal case, so using this convention, but it still is of course belonging to that action. I think that's pretty clear by the name. Now it's a class, and that class needs to implement the action interface we're importing from NGRX store. Action, as I mentioned earlier already, is an interface, not itself an object, and this interface being implemented into add ingredient now forces us to structure the add ingredient class in a certain way. To be precise, we need to have a type property in the add ingredient class, and that type is the identifier of this action. Now this will always be an add ingredient action, so type here should simply be add ingredient, so our string from up there. And now an extra annotation which we should add here is read only. That is a TypeScript feature which indicates to TypeScript that this must never be changed from outside. And if we ever try so from anywhere in our code, we'll get an error. And this simply enhances type safety and ensures that we don't mess up with our pattern. Now, as I mentioned, this action needs more than just a type though. It also needs the ingredient that should be added. And therefore, we can add more. We can add a second property, the payload, and that should be of type ingredient. And for that, you should also add an import to the ingredient model like this. Now with that, we finished our action definition. Now it still might be hard to see all these pieces come together, but we're almost there. Let's now use this action in the shopping list reducer. Let's extract the payload, and let's then finally work on registering the application store and also on selecting our state and dispatching actions.